This is a story about a young man named Jorge, who was trying to find himself. It is a story of love, loss, sorrow, and pride. Most importantly, it is a story of hope. I will never forget the first time I met her. She had this beautiful smile, and she looked at me like she wanted to tell me something important. That one glance was all I needed to know that our worlds would eventually collide. But when I asked my father about her, he said she wasn't from this world. So, I dismissed any thought of pursuing a relationship with her. Besides, we were different races. She was an elf and I am just your normal human being. I was born in a small town on the outskirts of the kingdom of Aelistra, which is ruled by Queen Elissa. She is one of the most revered queens in history, who has brought peace and prosperity to many people in our lands. Her Majesty rules the people as their beloved leader, and has helped countless individuals get ahead in life, despite whatever hardships they may have faced. I have always looked up to her since I was young, even though we were different in almost every way possible. I didn't care if she wasn't from this world or not. It only made her more beautiful in my eyes, for what other race can match such grace? She was an elf, and that meant there was a higher possibility that she had magical powers. Who knew, maybe she could heal a person or help cure someone's ailment with just a wave of her hand. I mean, I was only a lowly commoner from a poor village. I would never stand a chance against the powerful princess she was. It's true, there were no records of anyone like her being born to the elven race. So, it was safe to say that the odds were against me, but that didn't mean I had to give up. There must be a way. If not, then my parents had lied to me. After my parents passed away, I moved out of my childhood home and found a place of my own. I started work as a blacksmith, where I earned my pay and saved up enough money to travel. That way I could find my way into the capital city and search for her. Maybe one day I would see her again. As I traveled, I realized that traveling wasn't so easy. You needed to be able to make sure that you were protected from anything and everything that could harm you. For example, bandits are known to attack travelers in the woods. They would try to steal your valuables, and even kill you for a few extra coins. Luckily, I was trained in the sword, so I always made sure I had a weapon close at hand. After years of traveling, I had managed to accumulate enough gold to start my own smithy. So, when I finally settled in my new town, I decided to put my knowledge to use and make my own armor and weapons. One of my customers had told me about the elven princess. When I heard this, it really piqued my interest. She was an elf and there were hardly any of them here. It wasn't long before I had saved up enough money to travel to Aelistra, and I had no idea what to expect. All I knew was that she lived somewhere in the palace, and I had to somehow find my way inside. I was nervous, yet excited at the same time. This was going to be quite an adventure. It took some convincing, but I convinced the guard to let me enter. The guards knew how much I had been saving up to go see her, and they believed I was worthy enough to meet Her Majesty. Once I was in the room, I saw the Queen sitting behind her desk, looking very regal in her golden gown. She smiled and welcomed me into her presence. "My dear boy," she said, "you've done well to come all the way here." "Yes, Your Majesty," I replied. "I am here because I want to talk to you about the elven princess." Queen Elissa gave me a questioning look. "Elves?" she asked. "Are you talking about that beautiful young woman?" "No, I'm sorry, Your Majesty." I mean Princess Annabel, I answered. The Queen's face changed from confusion to amazement. Oh no, she shouted with surprise. She is not here. She left us just 2 days ago. What do you mean she's gone? Where did she go? She went to visit her family in her village. That was a while back now, and we still haven't heard from her. I see, I sighed. It sounds like things between our kingdoms weren't exactly as you said. Did Princess Annabel speak to you of her travels? Do you know anything about where I should begin my search? She did, Your Highness, she answered. We have had many visitors recently, and we have been busy with them. However, Princess Annabel told us nothing about your quest. I hope you know what you are getting yourself into. Well, if she didn't mention anything to you, then it's not my fault, I said. I need to get back to my shop and continue making my own products. If I don't make them soon, I'll be forced to close down. The Queen looked at me and smiled, a little sadder than before. My dear boy, I am truly sorry. She is not here. I wish that she were. Thank you for telling me anyway. Is there any way I can contact her? I doubt it, she replied, and she is not here to answer if she has. The Queen turned her attention towards the window, a sigh escaping her lips. There is something I can tell you about the Elven Kingdom, she said. You know how elven children are raised in the forest. We have strict rules set out for them. The child must learn everything that he needs to know in order to survive in the wilderness. They are taught how to hunt, how to defend themselves, and they are also taught to read and write. The elves will not allow their children to live in the cities, as they fear the human ways. But once a year, they are given the chance to leave the forest and live in the city. It is a tradition that has been passed down for generations. That's wonderful. I replied with excitement. What does this have to do with Annabel? The Queen turned back towards me with a sly smile on her face. Do you know what awaits them when they leave the forest? Not really, I answered hesitantly. Is it dangerous? It can be, she said with a shrug of her shoulders, but only if they are careless. Careless? I asked with concern in my voice. What does that mean? Young boys and girls are often lured into trouble by other young people, she said as she stood up from her chair and walked over towards me with a serious look on her face, and many times they end up getting hurt or worse. If they are lured into trouble, then why would they want to leave their home? Wouldn't they just stay away from the city and stay safe? There are many reasons that a child would leave their home, she replied solemnly. But as long as they follow all of our laws of the forest, then they will be safe. So where do they go when they leave? What is their destination? They go to the capital city of our kingdom, where they will be welcomed and given a job by one of our citizens. That's great. But how do they get there? It's not like they can just walk around town. No, dear boy, she said with a chuckle, they have a long journey ahead of them. After my conversation with the Queen, I went back to my shop to try and make more soap. Unfortunately, there was only so much that I could do without any raw materials. I sat down at the counter and thought about what I should do next. If I wanted to get to the elves and save Princess Annabel, then it meant that I would have to find a way to get to the forest first. That might prove to be difficult, as I didn't know anything about getting to their country. Then again, maybe it wouldn't be hard at all. The elves were probably pretty easygoing. I was sure that they would be happy enough to let someone who they didn't even know come into their home and help them. After all, the princess had told me that they would provide me with supplies and food, so I couldn't think of a reason why they wouldn't want me to go. While I was sitting there on the floor, trying to figure out how I should proceed, the door opened and a man walked in. He was taller than most humans, but he was still short compared to an elf. His hair was a deep brown that was almost black, and he had bright blue eyes that seemed to see right through me. He looked like he was in his early 50s, and he wore a navy blue tunic that covered him from head to toe. There wasn't anything special about his appearance, yet he seemed to exude confidence. I couldn't tell if he was a noble or a merchant, but he definitely caught my eye. "Welcome, sir," said the barkeep in a cheerful voice, as the man walked up to the counter. "Would you care for a drink? Or some wine, perhaps?" The man waved a hand dismissively towards him and said, "Thanks, no thanks." He looked straight at me, causing me to be on guard. As he began to speak, the smile he gave me caused me to relax. "Good evening, mister." I gave him my name and introduced myself. "How about yourself?" I asked curiously. "My name is Lucius," said the man with a slight bow to me, "and this is a pub located within the royal district of Sorliza. Do you know of its name?" "Well, no, not really," I responded slowly. "How would I?" "Very astute of you to ask," he said with a wink, "but for a lowly innkeeper such as I am, I suspect that you don't care too much about your surroundings. Are you from Sorliza?" I asked excitedly, because I'm visiting the royal castle, which is just a few streets away from here. Quite the coincidence, isn't it? "That's nice to know," Lucius said as he sat down on a nearby stool. "I assume that you are looking for work because it would make sense for someone with good knowledge of the city like yourself to help people visit the castle." "Yes," I replied confidently, "I've done it dozens of times." "Why didn't I notice your business card at the Guildhall when I came here earlier?" he asked curiously, "and what if I refused to sell my services?" "It has been several days," I replied quickly. "Do you think that I haven't gotten far enough with selling the cards?" Lucius paused momentarily while his eyebrows raised high with amusement. "How very sneaky you are, young man." He finished drinking half of the drink the barman handed to him, set the empty cup aside, then began, "I assume that since you found my bar it is because of the mark of quality you put on all of your work. Thus, I am confident that you can deliver quality workmanship in a timely manner, as you do in your own shop." "Well, you've already seen some samples that I've made," I explained as I showed him the pewter statues that I created a few days earlier. The entire time I was explaining my method for making these little statues, the bar owner never blinked, except when he nodded every once in a while to confirm that I was telling the truth. Even though the man was clearly well versed in the art of negotiation, I remained convinced that he would keep his word and pay me. I saw no reason to worry about it. "Excellent, excellent indeed," Lucius said as he took a few seconds to admire each statue. "That is wonderful work, and I will surely use those examples to give potential customers a preview of what they may expect from you." "Great." I cheered. "Then we're both happy. See?" I pointed at him triumphantly. "We both win." "Indeed," Lucius agreed. "We shall have a deal." After 2 hours of talking, the man finally paid me the full price for my work. With a smile I stood up and turned around to walk back home, only to find that Lucius wasn't behind the bar anymore. I searched all over the place, and eventually found him walking towards me with a bag slung across his shoulder. "You're leaving so soon?" I asked in surprise. "What happened?" Well, he started and placed a hand on his chin. It seems that our conversation inspired some interest amongst the local nobles and merchants. They want me to create a number of statues for them, each one depicting their family members or other prominent figures from the city. It means more money coming in, and I am sure that you will be able to use this extra income. You must agree, yes. Absolutely. I exclaimed enthusiastically, that's fantastic news. Thank you so much for believing in me. He smiled happily and replied, I know how hard it is to get ahead in life, especially for someone like yourself. I want to help you out as best I can. After all, the people who need to buy statues from me will be the most prominent people of this city. There's no better way to advertise my business than this. Yes, I couldn't have said it any better myself. I agreed. In addition to that, Lucius continued, if we work together you might have an opportunity to visit the castle whenever you want. The king and his family spend a lot of time there, and it would be very nice for me to make the acquaintance of someone with a good head for business. I didn't know what to say at first, but I nodded my agreement anyway. This was definitely one of the best days I've had since I got to Sorliza, and I was excited about working with Lucius. He was a great man, and I was eager to see the statues he promised me. I wanted to meet the people he talked about, and I hoped that they'd pay me enough so that I wouldn't have to worry about money anymore. You are the one who should be thanking me, young man, not the other way around. Lucius chuckled happily, now let's go back home, I need to pack some things. As we walked towards his house I could hear my friend's footsteps growing fainter. After only 2 hours together he seemed to have vanished into thin air. I sighed happily, feeling more satisfied than ever before. Weeks went by. Lucius made as many statues as he could, and I took the opportunity to sell my pewter statues to the nobles and wealthy merchants around the city. I received money from these customers and used them to make new statues, so my work never stopped. I always put the same mark on every statue I made, and Lucius would take photos of it when he sold something to a customer so that I could replicate it in case anything happened to the statue I delivered to them. It seemed like everything was going smoothly, and my income grew steadily over the months. The extra money gave me the freedom to start my own business and quit working for Lucius, but I still kept up our arrangement of trading services. I couldn't stop thinking about Princess Annabelle. I secretly hoped I would run into her someday while traveling. Good morning, Mr. Pharaoh. The sound of my name being called out surprised me. I looked around and saw a girl holding a bouquet of flowers. She had brown hair, deep green eyes, and she wore a green dress and a white apron with a pocket. A black bow was tied around her waist. Oh, hello, I greeted her. Who are you? My name is Kari, and these are some flowers from my garden. You may pick them if you'd like, just let me know when you're done. Thank you, I replied, I would love to take them. After taking the bouquet and thanking her, she handed me an envelope. I sat down at one of the tables and opened the letter. I was expecting some sort of reply from the king or another nobleman who wanted to buy my statues, and so I wasn't very interested in what was inside the envelope. However, to my surprise I read the words, I know you probably think this is too soon, but I have fallen in love with you, and I want to marry you. The letter ended abruptly without giving any further details. The letter was dated the day before, which meant it came from Princess Annabelle. My heart began pounding and I started wondering if I had made a huge mistake by agreeing to become her servant. Do you know who that is? I heard someone ask behind me. I turned around and saw the girl from the garden standing right next to me, with the same bouquet in her hand. I wondered what she could possibly want from me. You seem surprised, Kari stated. Are you in love with the princess? I don't know who you mean. I answered honestly, what do you want? She didn't respond. Instead she looked me up and down carefully, as if she were trying to see into my soul. After a few seconds she gave me a little smile, and walked away towards the street. Wait. I called out, but she didn't stop. I stood there for a few minutes, staring after her. Was she a friend of Annabelle? Or did she have some other reason for approaching me? It seemed like she wanted to say something to me, but I wasn't sure what. It was only a matter of time until the prince came to visit Lucius. I wondered what would happen once he arrived, and how much money it would take for me to convince him to give up the statue that I'd made for Princess Annabelle. I decided I had better come up with a plan now, while I still had a chance to change it. Lucius was sleeping when I went inside his house. He didn't seem to be very interested in getting up early, and so I thought it was best if I waited for him outside. I had just sat down on one of the chairs next to the front door, thinking about the prince's imminent arrival, when I felt a light pressure on my head. I quickly lifted my eyes, and saw Kari looking at me from the other side of the street. Are you all right? She asked. You look pale. I smiled at her, and she gave me a nod of understanding, then sat down next to me. What do you want? I asked. Can I sit here? She replied. I didn't have the heart to say no, so I gestured towards the chair in front of me. She sat down, placed her hand on my leg, and gave me an innocent smile. Sorry if I'm disturbing you, I said. I didn't know you were there. You haven't done anything wrong, Kari replied, and besides, I wouldn't miss this for anything. I've been watching out for you since we first met. Well, you can stop watching me now, I told her. It's all over. The prince has accepted the statue you wanted him to give away for you. What? Kari gasped. How is that possible? Have you given it to him yet? Is it worth a lot of money? The statue you made is one of a kind, and it's beautiful, I explained to her. The prince promised to give it to Princess Annabelle. It will make her very happy, but I'm afraid you can't have it. Kari sighed loudly and looked at the ground with disappointment. She took off her white apron and began unbuttoning her blue dress. Her long brown hair fell down to her shoulders as she got up and walked towards me. She put her arms around my neck and pulled me close. Then she kissed me passionately on the lips. Do you feel sorry for me? She asked. Of course not, I told her. You are a beautiful girl. I just don't think you're ready for a relationship. I know how much you must want to marry Prince Lucius, but he doesn't love you. In fact, I don't think he even likes you. He only wants to use your beauty and money to make himself more powerful. He will never take a step that would threaten his position. I wish things were different, but there's no way I could do anything to help you. You must make peace with that and move on with your life. She pushed me away from her, stood up and walked back to the street. I watched her go and wondered what she was going to tell the prince when he arrived. There was nothing I could do for her. The sun was already high in the sky by the time Lucius woke up. He opened the door to let me inside. You look exhausted, I said to him. You should get some rest. He yawned and gave me a tired smile. It's too late for that, he replied. I'm supposed to meet the prince at noon. If it looks like I'm not going to make it, he will send someone else. I have to be ready at any time. Is that why you haven't been getting much sleep? I asked. You're worried he might not show up? I wouldn't blame him if he did, Lucius replied. I can't offer him anything special. My house is old and small, and the only thing of value I have here is my statue. He won't stay long enough to see any other things I may have, so I'm afraid I'll have to give up something very important to me. Well, maybe the prince will like your house, I replied. It doesn't look half bad to me. No one has ever told me that before, he smiled. I've lived here for a long time, but no one cares about my house except me. Maybe it's because it's not as grand as other houses. Your house isn't important because it's big or fancy, I said. It's important because it belongs to a man who loves you. I know you've never had a boyfriend before, but Prince Lucius is different from all the others. He cares deeply for you, and he has more money than any other prince. I'm sure the king will be happy to accept his gift. Lucius frowned and turned towards me, then looked out the window and sighed loudly. I wish things were different, he muttered. The last time I saw my parents, they were dead. I placed my hand on his shoulder. Don't worry about it, I said. They didn't die because of you, and I'm sure you will see them again in heaven one day. You're right, he said, and maybe God will give me another chance to marry Princess Annabelle and help her to rule as queen. I could bring peace back to the kingdom, but I would have to be someone else and leave here. Is that really what I want? No, I told him, but you don't have any other choice. You need to find the courage to do this. You're not a coward, and you won't fail. If anything goes wrong, you can always just give the statue back to the prince and ask for your old job back. He took a deep breath and let it out slowly as he rested his head against the wall. That's a terrible idea, he said. I'd be making myself look stupid if I did something like that. Besides, the statue is only half finished. I got up from my chair and walked over to his bed. It'll be all right, Lucius, I told him. The prince probably wants the statue because it's very beautiful. He wouldn't care how much work you still need to do on it. Thanks, Jorge, he whispered. You always know what to say. I gave him a quick hug and left his room. I knew he didn't really feel better, but I had hoped the conversation might make him feel less depressed. I went to my room and took a long bath before leaving. My father's men were waiting for me outside. Have you heard anything about Princess Annabelle? I asked them. Nothing, one of them replied. She's not even on the Queen's schedule. We haven't seen her since last night. Well, there's no use worrying about it, I said. Maybe she will show up tonight. They looked at me and shook their heads, but they didn't speak. They knew as well as I did that there was nothing more we could do until the prince arrived. It had gotten dark by the time Lucius came home from meeting with the prince. He told me everything that had been discussed, and I tried to hide my disappointment when he told me he couldn't give him the statue. Lucius would have to wait a little longer to see his parents in heaven, but he had the rest of his life to live here. Do you want to stay here? I asked him. He smiled and looked down at his hands. I wish I could, but I can't be without my wife for very long. Besides, you need me to take care of the house and garden. I'm sure your wife is going to be happy with you back home, I said. Lucius nodded. If only this wasn't necessary, he said. I've always wanted to have a family of my own. I never realized it was so important until now. If I don't get married soon I might miss my chance, and then I'll end up like father. What are you talking about? I asked. You're still young, and there's nothing wrong with wanting to marry. My parents got married much younger than me, he explained, and they both regretted it later. The first year of marriage isn't the problem, but the second and third years are usually filled with constant fighting and tension. It takes a while for people to adjust to their new circumstances. Don't let that happen to you, I told him. If you ever have a fight with your wife, just remember that you love each other and always put the needs of your family first. Maybe that's why my father didn't want me to get married so early, he whispered. He thought there was no need to rush into things. Maybe if we waited until I had the right qualities, he would be proud of me. I wrapped my arms around his neck and hugged him tightly. Of course he will be proud of you, I reassured him. You're an amazing man. You have so many talents that would make you a good king one day, and you have a big heart and a warm smile. Not everyone could say the same. That's very sweet, but I wish we could be together tonight, he said. We could go to the temple and pray to my parents to watch over us and keep our marriage strong. Then we could sneak out of the palace and take a carriage ride through the forest. The forest is dangerous after dark, I reminded him. We should wait until tomorrow afternoon. No, he answered. I don't think I could sleep with the knowledge that Annabelle is out there alone. I need to meet with her tonight. Are you sure you want to do that? I asked. She must be feeling pretty guilty right now, and you're going to have to face her alone. What if she yells at you again or runs away? I'll handle it, he assured me. I'm sure she's already forgotten about last night. She knows I am innocent and that I didn't do anything wrong. All she has to do is talk to me once and apologize for being angry with me. That should be enough to convince her that I'm not a threat to anyone. His confidence made me uneasy, but I knew he wouldn't let anything bad happen to himself. He would protect himself and Annabelle as best he could. I believed he was right about her forgetting about last night, but I still worried about him meeting with her alone. I wished I could go with him, but there was nothing I could do. I went to bed wondering if Lucius would be safe. I woke up to sunlight streaming through the window. I opened my eyes and saw Lucius sitting next to me. His head was resting on his hand, and he was staring at the ceiling. Good morning, I yawned. How long were you watching me sleep? Not too long, he said. I couldn't sleep. Me neither, I admitted. I kept thinking about that poor girl who died last night. I hope her soul found peace. I know what you mean, he said. It's hard to believe a human could kill another human. Easy to imagine a human killing an elf, I retorted. After everything that's happened, all humans should be considered suspects. This doesn't change the fact that Annabelle did nothing wrong, Lucius stated. Her presence was strictly accidental, and she definitely saved my life when we crossed paths in the woods yesterday. She cannot possibly be the killer because she's innocent. What happens now that your theory is proven wrong? I asked. Nothing will change, he said. Nobody can tell us we have to go against Annabelle unless someone else admits guilt. At least we have a solution. Even if I was wrong, I was able to rule out any possibility that the killer was anyone from the palace, which was all I cared about. I guess you have a point there, and it was kind of interesting learning more about these killings, especially about the connection between them. The sooner this gets resolved, the better for everyone involved. We don't want to give the assassins ideas about how easy it is to assassinate a powerful person. That might actually work in our favor. We've become so well known over the past few weeks that others may start to think twice before trying to murder people, Lucius responded. However, we don't really need to worry about it today or tonight, only during the investigation itself. It is important to stay out of the police station to avoid being followed. Once they clear the princess and declare me innocent, I'll decide on what action to take after. I didn't know how much time passed since I'd first awoke, but soon Lucius spoke of food. If we want to be smart about hiding out, we need to go eat somewhere private, he decided. Maybe one of us can bring some bread later that the other person could spread a bit of margarine on while we sit on a bench or something. That sounds reasonable to me, although we probably need to stick to neutral areas, like the streets outside the temple. Hopefully none of those criminals ever hear of it or see it on the news. We gathered together our bags and left my room. Just as we closed my door behind us, Lucius began talking. In light of recent events, I think it's best if you spend more time by yourself and less time around me, just in case. I turned around and stared at him. Do you honestly think I'm a danger to your life? If I thought for a second that was the reason you had given for keeping me separated from the other humans, I would have had you escorted directly back to your house by the king's men. You wouldn't be doing that if you truly believed I was innocent. You said yourself, humans have been murdering elves for thousands of years, I retorted. The minute I show an ounce of emotion towards you, the first thing a suspicious mind will think is that I was in your company. But it looks to me like that was only your third time visiting each other this month. The way he smiled when he replied didn't exactly ease my concern. Really, it isn't so obvious if you stop to analyze things. For all anyone knew, you may have stayed together only a single day during that time, and no one even paid it any mind. What would that prove? I reached for his shoulders and held him firm in front of me. Lucius wasn't normally affected by such emotions, and my strength had always overwhelmed him. Now, he stared back with wide, nervous eyes. So now I am allowed to walk right out into the open once again. Not going to drag me across town as soon as people get wind that your queen has spoken of a possible elvish accomplice. Why don't we talk to each other on neutral ground to see what happens? If that won't solve anything, then we should avoid any places where I would expect you to run into the same dangers we were both attacked. You have a point. I do not want to put you in danger just because I made a bad decision. He pulled away from me and looked down at his hands. I wanted to comfort him, but I wasn't sure how to do it. He was trying to keep me safe, and I couldn't fault him for that. Are you okay? I finally asked. He took a deep breath, then slowly lifted his head and looked up at me. His expression softened, and I could tell he was struggling to hold back tears. I'm fine, I promise. Even though the danger may still exist, I am ready to face it. I just hope that you are truly as confident as you seem to be. I smiled at him. You're going to be fine, and I am too. I'll try and convince you of that until you believe me. He nodded and looked away from me. Then, he leaned forward and hugged me tight, and I embraced him back. I watched Lucius walk away from the temple, and I felt like I was watching a loved one go off to war. I knew it would be for his own good, but that knowledge didn't help me feel any better. I stayed inside the temple until long after dark, and I spent most of the time reading and thinking about the future. However, I also kept checking the window every few minutes, hoping to see him return. Lucius never came back. I waited a week before I started to wonder why he hadn't returned yet. He had told me that the princess was safe and that she would be released from prison within the next few days. It seemed odd that he would wait for her release before coming back to me. I spent another 2 weeks in the temple, waiting for him to come back. Then, almost exactly 3 months to the day after he'd left me, I heard the sound of footfalls approach the front doors of the temple. The steps grew louder as they neared, and I quickly stood up to greet him. When I opened the door, there was a guard standing in the entranceway. With my hand on the hilt of my sword, I glared at the man. "What are you doing here?" I demanded. "My lady, we received word from the palace that you had requested to speak to Princess Elise." I smiled sadly and shook my head. "She's dead." The guard looked shocked and stepped back away from the door. I followed him out of the temple and into the street. When we reached the front gates of the compound, I turned to look back at the building. "Where did you find her body?" The guard looked uncertainly between me and the gates. "The palace informed us that you wished to view her remains." "Oh. Sorry, I meant to say, where is her body?" "It was buried beneath the floor of your room." I frowned. "That's odd. Why would the princess' body be buried under my bed? And why would someone make an attempt to kill me not long after she was buried? No one else has ever tried to harm you since the princess was taken, so I assume that the person who murdered her is responsible for the wounds you suffered." I thought back to the night that the king had warned me of an unknown elf. "Yes, you're probably right. The palace already knows about the attack, but they haven't figured out who it is. Do you think this person will try to harm me again?" "Not if the palace thinks you are capable of defending yourself. If you can somehow discover the identity of whoever committed the murder, then they might be more willing to provide protection for you." I was silent for a moment. "Well, I suppose it wouldn't hurt to ask them." The guard smiled and bowed. "Thank you for the information, my lady. I'll inform the guards that you wish to visit the palace." "Do that," I said as I walked past him. "And thank you again." I spent several hours visiting with the palace, asking questions about the princess, the attempted murder, and everything else that had happened over the last few years. While I found out quite a bit, it only served to make things even more confusing for me. After speaking with a number of different people, including both the king and the queen, I discovered that the king believed that the killer must have been an elf. That made sense, given the way that the other elves reacted when I'd mentioned him. However, none of those conversations had revealed anything definitive. The palace also told me that the royal family was planning to leave Aragonia within the next couple of days. They were going to travel through the rest of the kingdom, gathering as much support and money as possible before returning home. This news hit me hard. I'd hoped that Lucius would return before he left, but it wasn't likely. I was confident that he would make it back eventually, but that was little comfort to me now. I spent most of the next 2 days wandering around town, trying to do something, anything that would distract me from the anxiety I felt. I wandered the streets, talked with friends, and visited the temple many times, all while keeping an eye out for Lucius. On the 3rd morning after his departure, I woke up feeling depressed. As I lay on my bed thinking of the upcoming trip to the capital, I couldn't help but feel like something terrible was about to happen. When I arrived at the temple that afternoon, I asked the priestess there what she could tell me about elves. She explained that the elves of Aragonia were peaceful people, and that they didn't often get involved in conflicts outside their own borders. For example, they don't typically fight each other, she explained. If they were to fight, it would most likely be because either one or both of them had been threatened by a greater force. They aren't really a threat to anyone, she added. With the exception of the city-states, no one else lives in the mountains. Why is that? I wondered. They are too high above sea level. There's not enough oxygen to sustain life there, so they don't spend much time near the surface. Okay, thanks. Are you sure you're alright? I nodded and smiled weakly. Yes, thank you. She shook her head, then offered me some advice. Maybe you should consider spending more time in the capital. It would give you a chance to see Lucius in person. Maybe that would help. I'm afraid I'm not very good at traveling, I replied. I've never traveled further than the capital before, and I doubt I'll get much farther than that during this trip. I guess not, she agreed. But you might be able to learn something about him in the meantime. You might be surprised how much you learn simply by watching him interact with others. I took a deep breath, then decided to go find Lucius. I wanted to spend some time with him, just to see if I could glean any additional information about him. I wandered the streets of town until I found him sitting at a table outside one of the taverns. He was reading a book, and he hadn't noticed me yet, which gave me plenty of time to observe him without having to worry about scaring him off. He seemed to be reading a story about a princess who had been kidnapped by a dragon. It was obvious from his expression that he was enjoying the story, but I couldn't help wondering if he'd actually experienced something similar himself. I sat down across from him, then studied him for a few minutes. His face was always carefully composed, as if he was worried that someone might read his thoughts if he allowed them to show on his face. He had dark brown hair, and his eyes were a pale blue. After a moment, I asked him, "How are you doing?" He looked up from his book and smiled. "I'm fine, thanks. How about you? How are things going with the investigation?" "Not bad," I replied. "I've been speaking with many people, and I think I'm getting closer to solving the case." "That's good," he said. "I'm glad that you're taking an interest in it." "Well, I know that you're leaving soon, so I wanted to make sure that I got all the information I could before you left." "It's a good idea to be thorough," he agreed. "If we can find out who did this, maybe they'll leave us alone in the future." "I hope so," I sighed. "But I doubt that will happen." Lucius nodded, then finished his drink. "You should probably head back to the palace. It's almost time for the royal family to leave." I nodded, then stood up and walked over to him. As I passed by, I gave him a hug, then pulled away and headed home. When I arrived at the palace, I went straight to my room. I wasn't surprised to find that there was a message waiting for me. It was from Lucius, and it was addressed to me personally. I opened it, then read through it quickly. "Hello, Kari. I wanted to thank you for your help yesterday. I don't know what I would have done without you. I'm sorry I didn't get to speak with you more, but I promise that I'll do everything I can to return to you as soon as possible. Stay safe while I'm gone, and please write often. Take care." My heart hurt every time I read his words, but I managed to hold myself together until I'd finished reading. Then I let myself cry for a long time, hoping that it would take some of the pain away. When I finally stopped crying, I closed the letter and put it aside, then lay down on the bed and stared at the ceiling. My vision blurred slightly, but after a few seconds, I began to feel sleepy again. The next morning, I woke up feeling even worse than I usually did, but I tried to stay focused on the task ahead of me. After breakfast, I spent most of the day talking to people who had seen anything unusual or suspicious. They all told me the same story. A woman with bright red hair had come into their shops and spoken to each of them individually. She had looked like a noblewoman, though none of them knew her name. None of them recognized her from anywhere else either. Finally, late in the afternoon, I spoke with an old lady named Samara. Like everyone else, she insisted that the only strange thing about the woman was her hair color. Unlike the other witnesses, however, she knew exactly where the mysterious stranger lived, and claimed to have known her since childhood. Apparently, the young woman grew up in a small village south of here, but had moved to the capital years ago. The villagers liked her well enough, especially once they realized that she worked hard and made herself useful wherever she was needed. But no one suspected that she was even capable of magic. They thought it must be a gift given to her by the gods themselves. When the king appointed the woman as my bodyguard, many of the people in the town felt betrayed, thinking that she should have stayed in the city rather than abandoning them. Most of these feelings were directed towards me, and I was forced to defend the decision constantly, along with my master, Lucius. Eventually, rumors spread that I had chosen her because I hoped for more opportunities to seduce her. This turned out to be completely false, but the accusation remained with me for months afterwards. As I traveled around the town, I saw that many of its buildings had burned to the ground. Some of the homes had collapsed under the weight of the flames, and others still smoldered in the rubble. When I ventured inside the houses, I found charred bodies lying on the floor, the remains of anyone foolish enough to remain trapped within when the fire broke out. A crowd began gathering behind me as I gazed upon the destruction. They murmured angrily, wondering why such an injustice could occur in the capital itself. I quickly stepped outside and called for my horse before asking if any of them knew whose house this had belonged to. Several men raised their hands. One of them took a deep breath, then blurted out, "Lord Farwell's." With a sigh, I returned to the scene of the crime, and mounted my horse once more. From there, I rode through town for several minutes before coming across a building surrounded by guardsmen. A large sign had been fixed to the front door, written in gold paint. I paused in surprise as I read the words. In elegant script, the letters proclaimed, "Sacrificed on this mountain by the people of Albrija." Underneath, someone had added a simple line of text, which read, "For our leader and for what is right." The entire crowd watched silently as I approached the building, where a guard greeted me. He demanded to see my identification card before allowing me through the entrance. Apparently, the royal guards weren't yet accustomed to seeing outsiders, not after so much time spent patrolling the streets of the city instead. Inside, the place looked as dark as it always did, lit primarily by candles that hung over our heads. As I followed Lord Farwell deeper into the cave-like structure, I saw that torches were being lit near the doorway, casting flickering light on the walls and the statues lining both sides of the path. After we reached a hallway, at the center of the hall, he stopped me in front of another door and said, "You may enter now," his voice rough with emotion. "Take whatever you wish. I've arranged rooms upstairs in case your recovery needs more privacy. For now, please." His gaze fell onto the sleeping dragon curled in my lap. When I gave him no response, I saw pity appear momentarily on his face, and anger grow behind his eyes, as the doors slowly parted, admitting me inside the chamber where Alondu laid. I was shocked. It seemed unlikely that the man, whom I had always admired from a distance, even believed what we wanted was possible, at least, without putting himself directly into danger first. No, the reason he'd requested it didn't seem like it had anything to do with genuine trust between us. It might have just been guilt. Hadn't we ruined everything? The child that Lucius carried could end up being an embarrassment, wouldn't she? Then, what if the boys somehow ended up passing a gift, while the king and queen tried their best to conceal his lineage? Surely, our political rivals would never rest until Alondu himself came forth with every shred of evidence we'd gathered together. If he ever cared enough to help again, but as the hours dragged forward and dawn finally showed signs of creeping into my view, I had trouble believing such things. Every inch of our alliance now appeared suspect. Could anyone truly think the worst of all involved in this investigation, and be proven right in their assumptions? Had no one really anticipated that this meeting with Lady Remandra, whom everyone considered above suspicion in every aspect imaginable, wasn't merely coincidental to any actual wrongdoing taking place under the authority of her husband, also accused of such misdeeds now? Was their loyalty only held toward each other or away from themselves too? Maybe they couldn't wait forever for answers either. And who else here besides myself could possibly care about getting those questions answered properly? Who among us can stand against what is clearly defined as treasonous actions taken by the crown? Against lawlessness perpetrated beneath the very throne? That's exactly how far down this rabbit hole goes. Or perhaps some nobleman decided years ago to take advantage of having so great an army nearby. After all, war does bring wealth unto nations indeed. Perhaps these accusations are simply nothing but lies woven by enemies seeking vengeance upon Armandine Kingdom because, back home, kingdoms don't work well anymore since their nobility died off long ago. Oh gods, what kind of sick person thinks up something like that? But surely none of our opponents actually believe that nonsense anyway. How wrong must one fall in order to assume deception beyond reasonable doubt in someone innocent of crimes committed? Is insanity even allowed a seat in the courtroom nowadays? Has madness become contagious lately due to overpopulation increasing the number of mouths demanding foodstuffs? Have the hungry grown desperate enough to eat their own children, and then blame the royal family for the act? Does one have to die in order to be declared insane anymore? Can insanity survive death itself, and spawn offspring through the womb? Or are such ideas pure fiction, but only in the minds of madmen living in an ancient world? As I thought about the fate of the people I loved most in this life, I found myself lying in bed, staring up at the ceiling, as I wrestled with the thoughts whirling around within my head. At that moment, however, I heard a knock at the door, and in walked Sir Gareth with two men behind him. Both wore the same black cloaks and scarlet waistcoats, one bearing a sword on his hip, while the other's hand rested on the hilt of his longsword. Greetings. They both bowed to Alondu. Please forgive us for interrupting your rest. The man with the sword continued, We're here on behalf of His Majesty, King Rias. Lord Farwell responded before I could. Don't worry yourselves, this is my guest, he said, pointing to my sleeping form. Rest assured, she is safe in here. I will let her know when it is time. The two knights stepped aside and bowed once more. With that, they left the room, leaving Lord Farwell alone with me. He stood by the bedside for a while, looking down at me. I stared back at him unblinking. Finally, he spoke, saying, You know we must discuss matters concerning what happened last night. We cannot say any more than that. Oh, we certainly can't, I thought, recalling his words from earlier. It was, after all, almost midnight, and anyone worth their salt knew better than to make announcements of such gravity this close to dawn, especially with the potential for political repercussions following them. When the time comes, let it be known that we tried our best to keep the whole thing secret. In my heart, however, I felt that no amount of subterfuge would help my case now. I rose to my feet, wincing as I did so. Thank you, Lord Farwell, but I am not feeling very well today, and would prefer to spend some time in the comfort of my own chambers instead. I look forward to speaking with you soon. His reply surprised me. No, you don't need to hurry your recovery on my account. I've given orders for food and drink to be brought to you whenever you wish. Until then, feel free to stay where you are. How nice of him to offer. Unfortunately, I already ate and drank most of the food and water before breakfast arrived. After all, how could I expect any other outcome from the last few days of sleepless nights? What I needed were nourishment and rest, both of which I'd been denied, and as a result, I was quite weak. How exactly was I supposed to do that if I refused to leave my chambers for fear of being seen? Besides, if I stayed cooped up inside, I might start throwing things around again, and I didn't want to upset all of my hard work thus far by making a mess of my surroundings. My plan was working perfectly so far, and I couldn't afford to blow it now, or could I? Very well, Lord Farwell. Thank you for your kindness, I replied. What kind of man is this King Rias of yours? He's a fine king, a good friend, he said. Not many people know this about him, but he really does care for his subjects. Do you think the people of Armandine deserve that kind of leader? I know I do. A few moments passed. Do you mean to tell me that every one of us here in this kingdom, right here in these lands, was merely an experiment? I asked. It must be so, though, for if this is not true, you have nothing to gain by lying to me, and I have everything to lose. I'm not lying, he replied. Believe me when I say that I truly believe the best for the people of Armandine. This is why I wish to see you crowned as Queen. Queen of Armandine, I corrected. You know very well that I am not a princess, yet you persist in treating me like one. He considered my words for a moment, then nodded in agreement. Yes, I suppose you're correct, for there is no royal bloodline of our nation, and therefore, you are not royalty, but rather, a commoner, albeit a noble one. I sighed. If my circumstances had been different, perhaps that would have been enough to persuade me to accept this crown, but alas, they are not. The question remains, why do you even need a queen if you have no royal bloodline? Why not just elect someone to be the king, then decide who's going to be the queen later on? His face grew slightly red as he explained. With only one king at a time, the kingdom would be rife with infighting and chaos. There are no women in power, nor are there any male contenders to the throne. We have to wait until a child is born, which is no easy feat. More often than not, the child dies before it reaches the age of maturity. If a man is to rule over us, we must ensure that he is capable of doing so, and that is why we choose a woman for the position. And why are you suddenly bringing this up now, then? For all I know, you simply decided to switch from a king to a queen without any prior consultation with the people. Don't you care at all about our opinions? We discussed this long ago, remember, he said. The people supported your candidacy, and to date, the sentiment has remained the same. Everyone wants you to be queen, so why shouldn't you be? I couldn't argue that point. But then, wasn't that because everyone here thinks I'm a noblewoman? This town is full of nobles, but I don't seem to recall having any friends or relatives among them, except for the odd gossiper or two. How can they all be so blind? I thought to myself. Fine, then. If that's what everyone here wants, I will agree to it. As much as I hate to admit it, I know better than anyone else how much it would benefit the people if I agreed to take on the role. And truth be told, I wouldn't mind ruling over them, if only I had the choice. He looked confused. But you already do. You have all the rights and privileges of a queen. Come, let's go outside, I'll show you. So, he was going to trick me into believing that I had somehow earned some sort of title, and that I was now officially a queen, and furthermore, that I accepted it willingly. Well, that certainly worked. Hadn't I been questioning my own sanity back in the palace? Now that I was free of the pain and suffering I felt, I started to wonder whether or not my supposed memories were real, and if they weren't, did it matter? Was I really just a dumb, mentally retarded peasant girl who believed she was a princess? What had become of me? All I knew was that I wanted to return home to my parents. My adoptive father, Lord Farwell, could help me find my way back to the place where I belonged. No longer would I be made to feel inferior simply because of my gender. I'd finally be able to stand on equal footing with the men and lead them in doing whatever I saw fit. My heart swelled with love and adoration for the townspeople, so I was sure they would all gladly give their support and assistance. If anything, it would make them happy. After all, I would be the first queen that Armandine ever had, and their hopes rested on me. But what would happen once I returned home? Would they throw me a parade, and shower me with gifts and accolades? Or would they simply ignore me altogether? In fact, I wondered what would happen if I came back as another woman. It would almost certainly cause a stir, for no one here knows me as a woman other than myself. Will everyone here hate me for leaving? I thought to myself. Will anyone believe me when I tell them that I am actually a princess? I shivered. I have never seen you look more radiant than you do right now, Mainland, said Erin, who stood near me. She leaned close to whisper in my ear. And you should be very proud of yourself. Do you know how many of us would die to have such a chance? Our people are lucky to have someone like you leading them. I smiled at her words. The people cheered and applauded after I gave my acceptance speech. The cheers became deafening once I had spoken the word Rune Majesty. They were too loud for me to hear myself speak for the rest of the ceremony, and they went on for nearly an hour afterwards. Afterward, I met with the lord of this town, and his family, as well as the leaders and representatives of all the villages within its borders. I listened carefully to everything they said, but mostly I felt impressed by their passionate cries of praise for me. You see, Lady Queen, we've been waiting for you forever. Please, we need you. Save our town. Oh, gods, please save us. I didn't have time to talk to everyone individually, but the men and women around me spoke so much faster than most humans, and my tongue struggled to keep up with their demands. I could only assume that they must be speaking quickly out of fear that they might miss something. Thankfully, I had my bodyguard, Uriel, along with a few servants with whom I was familiar, as well as my loyal maid, Elena. Finally, I managed to quiet them enough that I could hear what they had to say. In a moment, Your Majesty. First, we have a small token of our gratitude. We would like to present you with. At that moment, the crowd parted and two large horses stepped through. One was white, and the other was black, although it seemed to shift color from blue to red to green, depending on which light one saw it in. As soon as they emerged, the crowd erupted in applause again, and the townsfolk began to surge forward to touch the animals' backs. Erin pushed her way to the front of the throng, and I saw that she was wearing a strange smile on her face. Curious, I took a step toward her. What is it? She smiled wider. This horse is known among the people of Roermond as a two-effling horse, for he has two distinct colored eyes. And his colors change with your emotions. Some say that the black horse represents the hatred for the two-efflings within them, while the white represents the purity and nobility of their souls, despite their birth. This is said to bring good fortune to all who ride him. How wonderful! But what is the second horse? I asked. She laughed loudly. It's called a dragon horse, and it looks exactly like the other one. Only with scales instead of fur. Suddenly I understood. Oh, of course. You're telling me that each of these horses is capable of transforming into a dragon? She nodded enthusiastically. Exactly. But it will take a bit of magic to make that happen. That's why we brought him here to the castle. The dwarfs can do the job, but since the King of Roermond doesn't want to deal with us, we were forced to take matters into our own hands. I frowned and shook my head. I don't understand. Why not just ask me to create the transformation spell myself? After all, I have the powers and talents of a sorcerer. She looked away and shrugged. Well, we tried, but the spells are rather complicated, and your father didn't think you'd be willing to help. He wanted you to come to Roermond to personally meet him. Apparently, he thinks it will make you feel better about his offer. She stared at me intently. Now, do you still wish to travel there, or are you willing to stay here and be our queen? I took her by surprise with my unexpected response. That sounds even better than going to Roermond. I will give you my answer once I have spoken with Mystra. She blinked at me. But you already answered your question earlier today. You told me that you would accept the position of Duke of the Forest. I smiled. I did indeed. But I never said anything about living in the forest permanently. It is simply where I'm happiest at the moment. I am considering what I might build upon the land once I decide to stay. Her expression grew confused. But you won't be able to make any such decision until you return home. I mean, you need to make sure that your mother is well, and she needs to tell you some things first. I shrugged. Mother has many years left in her, and I trust her to live out those years happily. Besides, I can always visit her if she becomes ill and is unable to leave her bed. She pursed her lips and raised an eyebrow, looking somewhat unhappy. Then, almost as though she were reading my mind, she chuckled. Yes, you do seem to be changing your tune quite a bit recently. Anyway, back to the task at hand. We came here because this place used to be ruled by the elves long ago. It seems the kingdom now belongs to Lord Roderick. So we need to convince him to let us take over the area. What do you think should happen? I studied her closely for a moment before answering her question. Well, there's one more important thing that we need to do before we can make any deals with Lord Roderick. And that is? I nodded toward Galen, and his men standing guard outside the front gates of the castle. I want those traitors taken out of power. Erin looked at me for a moment in silence before nodding back at Galen's men standing guard outside the castle entrance, and then she turned back toward me with a smile on her face. You are so very dangerous. And so very beautiful, I replied with a grin of my own before turning back toward Galen's men once again and continuing in a more serious tone, so let's get started. The castle of Roderick was located on a high hill overlooking a beautiful vale that was filled with thick forest and a sparkling stream that wound its way through it like a golden ribbon before disappearing into a faraway lake in the distance. One could see for miles from atop that hill, and even though we were still several miles away from where we needed to be, I could tell that this place was tremendous in size, 4 or 5 times larger than any castle I had ever seen or heard about before. There were 3 huge towers at each corner of the castle, and each one was taller than any other building in sight here in this land, including the impressive tower that held Mistress Tower at Ashmouth Castle back home. The main building appeared to be much larger than any other building as well, so large that it seemed impossible for anyone inside to see all sides of it from their fixed location inside it. Smoke. There was smoke everywhere. The castle was on fire. But I couldn't see any sign of anyone else inside save for Galen and his men posted at the entrance gate, as well as several soldiers patrolling the grounds outside it. There were no sounds coming from within those walls other than the incredibly loud roar of flames roaring from within them, as well as several shouts coming from inside it as well. The entire place seemed deserted except for us 2 ragged-looking men walking on the road outside of it with our heads held high and our backs ramrods straight as we headed straight toward them with our hands empty at our sides. What is going on? I asked aloud as we neared the castle gate and continued walking past it toward the main building. Are you on fire as well as I am? Or is someone inside fighting these fires? Erin didn't answer me, but she did smile. It was a happy but worried smile. She looked around to make sure that nobody could hear us before speaking in a quiet whisper. It seems Lord Roderick is in trouble. We need to hurry. I turned my head in the direction of her whisper to see if the rest of our company had come with us yet, but there was no sign of them yet. And where are the others? Have they not come with you to help you defeat Roderick? Why are we the only ones here? Erin just kept smiling, but when she spoke this time, her voice was very serious. Roderick has his own forces in place to prevent anyone from coming here. It would seem that he has anticipated any attempts by us to attack him directly. He's prepared for what he expects to be the first wave of attacks. Well, I suppose I can't argue with that. It does seem that we've been here before. So how do you expect us to defeat him? Isn't that why we're here? Erin paused for a moment to look at me and then answered in a soft voice. You already have. Huh? She nodded back at the main castle. Look over there, those soldiers patrolling the grounds outside the gates, and those standing watch inside the castle tower. They all died last night while sleeping. We killed them without so much as getting up from our beds, didn't we? That's how we defeated Roderick. I just looked at her for a second before shaking my head, as I tried to think through the ramifications of what she was suggesting. We killed the people who were protecting Lord Roderick, but how did that actually defeat him? Erin smiled. Because the next time they wake up to find out that there is no one to protect them, they will find themselves on their own. "That's what you said," I replied with a confused expression, but Erin just continued to smile and nod back at me. I thought about it for a moment. She was right, we'd been here before. We'd done something like this once before, hadn't we? Then how did Roderick defeat me and my brothers? Erin started to reply with another nod, when we both heard the sound of galloping hooves coming from behind us. Turning around, we saw a group of 6 men on horses riding straight toward us. They looked like they had just come from a battle and were still dressed in their full armor. As they approached us, each rider dismounted and stood face to face with us, looking down at the ground between his feet as he stared at the dirt, with the same look of fear that I expected to see on their faces. It was obvious to me that they were not used to fighting people with swords. They were just plain scared of us, and as they looked up at us, I could tell by their eyes that they were scared of me in particular. The big one, who appeared to be the leader of the group, had a very large, muscular build. He was probably the strongest of all of them. I guessed that he'd been the man who had actually held the sword against my throat the night before. There was another one standing next to him whom I thought might have been the biggest of them all. He was still a little shorter than I was, but I had an almost instant sense that if this guy ever took his eyes off of me for a second, I would be dead before he turned to look at anything else. I was sure of it. I tried to hide my surprise when I saw the 2 soldiers who had attacked us the night before, but they weren't looking at me now, they were looking past me at Erin. I suppose it didn't really matter to them whether I lived or died. The 3 of us were simply obstacles in their way, nothing more. I was too small to be much of a threat to them. But they must not have known about Erin and her ability to control people's minds. Their expressions remained fearful as they looked down at the ground and waited to hear what she wanted to tell them. "We've come to defeat Roderick, as you should have realized by now," she said to them in a calm voice that immediately put both of us at ease. "You can help us or you can die." As soon as those words passed through her mouth, both of our opponents dropped their gaze from the ground to look up at her. She smiled and nodded back to them again, but then she spoke. "I am Erin. My husband is Thorn. We are the ones you came here to fight. You know what we're going to do to you if you don't fight with us. If you surrender and join us, we will give you the same deal that Lord Roderick gave your commander, a chance to live as long as you continue to serve him. The choice is yours. I only ask that you choose quickly. Time is not on our side. Either join us or die." With that said, Erin walked over to me and took my hand, leading us away from the group. As we did so, one of the soldiers came running up behind us to follow us. I was afraid that this guy would just follow us around wherever we went until either he or we had no energy left to stand, but to my surprise, Erin stopped and turned toward him as if to stop the man from following us. She spoke to him quietly for a moment before turning back to face the others who were still staring at the ground, but this time there was an intensity in her eyes that told me that she meant business. "Rise up," she shouted at the group. "Look me in the eyes. Stand up straight. Look me in the eyes. What are you afraid of? There is nothing to be afraid of anymore. I have promised you that you will not be killed unless you try to kill me. And even if you do try to kill me, I promise to end your lives in a manner that will make you feel like you've died. You will not die easy. I promise. I am the woman you fear. I am the one who killed all of your men last night. You came here to kill me, and you still cannot look me in the eyes. Why? They were silent for a while after she asked them this question. At first it seemed as if they might not answer her, but then finally one of them raised his head and spoke. His voice was so quiet that I could barely hear him over the sound of the horses' hooves. "We don't know," he said to her, trying to keep his voice down so that the rest of the group wouldn't be able to hear. "We're just scared. That's all." Erin turned back toward us with a triumphant smirk on her face. "Now, that's better," she said, but her smile quickly disappeared as we heard the sounds of horses coming from behind us. At the same time, Erin felt something pass through the air behind her. Before she knew what had happened, a horse kicked her in the side and sent her sprawling into the dirt. I ran forward, grabbed her arm, and pulled her up before the next horse could strike her again. She looked back at me with anger in her eyes, and shook her head as she tried to push me away. "I didn't tell them to do that," she shouted at me as she continued to try and pull herself up on my arm. I felt an anger burning deep inside of me, as well, but instead of lashing out at Erin, I simply pushed her off of me and walked back over to where Thorn and our guards were standing. "You promised me that they would stop if I told you to." "I didn't tell them anything," she shouted at me, but I was already too far away to hear her over the noise of the horses' hooves. We waited for the soldiers to come riding up, but after several minutes we started to wonder if it was just a bad dream or something. There weren't any more arrows being shot at us, and even the horses were no longer screaming, so we turned to each other to make sure that everything had truly been forgiven. I found myself looking into Thorn's eyes, and all I wanted to do was wrap him up and hug him close. His eyes held mine for a moment as he smiled at me and then turned to speak to the men who were still standing there. He walked over to where one of their leaders stood, but I couldn't hear what they were saying because of the horses. After they finished talking to each other, Thorn turned back to face us, and Erin ran up to join him. "Let's get out of here," she said, and then she started leading the way. We started moving away from the soldiers as fast as we could, and Erin kept looking back over her shoulder at the group of soldiers behind us, shouting angrily at them. She stopped once she realized that they were no longer following her. Then she led us past the man who was sitting against the tree, and when he saw Erin walk by, he shouted something at her. "I hope that you get what's coming to you." And that was a story about a young man named Jorge, who was trying to find himself.